Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Dr. Laura Healy and Joseph Stanford. Welcome both.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having us.
Super excited to be speaking with you today. Let's start where we always start. Let's do some introductions. Laura, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Healy. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Nottingham Trent University. And I guess I've got a really diverse interest in sport and exercise psychology, and do work from everything from elite performance all the way to working in the community with community groups, trying to look at trying to increase physical activity and mental health in sort of quite diverse populations. So that's, I guess, my academic interests. And in terms of sort of wider interests, I like pretty much all sport, and I'm quite a keen hockey player, and so I play hockey regularly and also do some coaching in that regards. And in a previous life, a long time ago now, I worked as a sailing instructor in outdoor centres, and so really learned a lot actually through that experiences around sort of how we can teach people and how we can enhance their performance without probably knowing it at the time. It's only as I've learnt more and more about sort of sports psychology and pedagogy that I've understood that a bit more.
What drew you to the world of sports psychology then?
So I did my undergraduate at Bangor University, which was fabulous. And I went there doing sports science, thinking I'd probably be a PE teacher. And within a week, I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. Like, I don't want to be a PE teacher. I want to do all this stuff. This is really interesting. And really enjoyed all aspects of sports science, actually. And probably, as I went to do a master's, was a bit of a crux of which route I go down. But I think the psychology always drew me a little bit stronger. I really like understanding probably the behavioural sides of it more than anything else. And so I'm particularly interested in understanding what drives our behaviour, probably like a lot of sports psychologists. And then have sort of, I guess, fallen into different roles and opportunities as they've presented themselves. But I just think understanding why we behave the way we do and the interactions in between the individual and the environment is really, really interesting to me.
And of course, going to Bangor, was it your undergraduate? I mean, that's such an incredible institution for sports psychology, isn't it? You're surrounded by some of the world's leading academics in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly I had absolutely no idea of that when I applied, and I went there. I went there because it was a really pretty place, and you know, the mountains and the sea, I still miss them every single day. But yeah, I feel very lucky to have learned and worked really closely with some of those people, and still do work quite closely with some of them, because I think it also trained me very well in research design and good quality research, but also about thinking about practical aspects. A lot of their work is so applied and really theoretically strong too, but they're always thinking about what does this actually mean, and also being prepared to think a little bit differently about things and thinking about looking at the more unusual things, which I think is quite interesting. And yeah, very lucky to have worked there alongside those people.
And it's very topical at the moment for us on the Sports Psych Show, because we just had Dr. Tim Rees on the show talking about the Great British Medalist Project. So we're probably going to have sort of back-to-back Bangor editions in a sense, because I know you're now at Nottingham Trent. But look, it's great to have you on, Laura, and Joseph Stanford. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my story is kind of quite simple, and I suppose one of those classic ones. I was a swimmer myself, and between me and you, Dan, I wasn't very good. So that kind of started my interest in terms of when I was an athlete, kind of, well, why are those other swimmers better than me? And then that curiosity kind of led me on to a poolside, and still trying to figure out why is that athlete better than the other athlete, or what does this athlete kind of have them strengths? And I went through the traditional coaching qualifications within our sport, and we swim in still to this day, quite a physiologically based program. And a lot of my development when I was younger was under the work of Dr. Mike Perriboon, who did a fantastic job in teaching us quite complex physiological principles and made them extremely simple. So once I'd kind of done that, the second level of exploration that I wanted to look into was it's okay having this bank of knowledge in terms of physiological ideas and periodization and tapering and all these wonderful ideas. But how do you get the athletes to do that? And what do you do when they don't want to do that? Or what do you do when they do that too well? And that kind of took my ideas into the human elements of it. And that landed me in Nottingham Trent University. And that landed me in a great department, and completed my undergrad where we managed to get this paper published in terms of how do coaches and athletes interact together in order to facilitate fantastic relationships.
Well, you've inadvertently there, Joseph, within your biography, introduced us, the audience, to what we're going to be talking about today. And that's that relationship piece. You, within your PhD, have written a paper supervised by Laura and alongside regular Sports Psych Show guest, Dr. Ms. Sarkar, and also Dr. Julie Johnston as well. So it's a collaboration for Nottingham Trent University. And the title of the paper is this: it's Interpersonal Perceptions of Personality Traits in Elite Coach-Athlete Dyads. You've been fascinated for some time, Joseph, with personality science and coach-athlete relationships, and you've brought those together in this paper. You want to know more about how personality influences coach-athlete relationships. You've kind of given us a bit of a backdrop to this. Is there any more you want to add to that sort of mini introduction there, Joseph?
Yeah, so obviously through my experience as being a coach, I figured out that we are like all other people in terms of we all have a personality. We are like some people, but then also we're like no one else. And when I was looking at kind of some topics of interest in terms of for my undergrad, I came across personality research. And the reason why it really struck my interest was as a coach, you can absolutely fundamentally observe people being different. And they all are. We all have our own unique idiosyncrasies and similarities. And then when I started to read some of the literature, it became quite apparent that the statistics within particularly the big five are extremely strong and extremely reliable. But then also when I found that your personality is linked at a biological level. So we absolutely know that your hippocampus at the back of your brain where it meets your spine is related to how neurotic you are, how much you worry or don't about problems. Or the fact that your limbic system, which is right in the center of your brain, is linked to how extroverted you are. And that really sparked my interest, because as a coach, I can be quite confident in terms of what I am observing and what I can use interpersonally is lined up statistically and biologically to a lesser degree. So I thought it was a really good tool in terms of how coaches and athletes discover better collaboratively in order to be successful.
Laura, has personality science, personality characteristics, has this been something that you've always been interested in, or when Joseph approached you about this, the potential to do some research here, was this something that was fairly new for you to explore as a supervisor?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, actually. So having sort of studied at Bangor, they obviously do a lot of work in personality there. And so for my own undergraduate and master's project, which was about 1 million years ago now, I looked at different aspects of personality, and again, the big five in relation to initially ironic effects theory, so seeing whether different aspects of different levels of neuroticism would impact upon the sort of tendency to experience ironic effects. So where exactly the opposite of what we want to happen happens. Yeah. And also from a master's project, looked at whether neuroticism could also moderate how effective imagery was for people. So it's something which I'd looked at certainly earlier on in my academic career, but hadn't looked at for a while. So it was quite exciting to kind of come back to it and to look at it. And I think it's certainly an area which historically, both I think in mainstream psychology and in sports psychology, has gone through waves of popularity. So I think, in the early sports psychology, we were really interested in, right, what are the personality characteristics of elite athletes? And I think probably because of my training at Bangor, I'm led to question that, to say that's not really important, because actually we can have a range of personality characteristics in different individuals at different levels, which may or be more or less effective. And what's more interesting is trying to understand how can we help coaches and athletes with a range of personality characteristics to, in this case, work together well, or in other research, perform well, either individually or collectively. And I think that's much more exciting and a bit less deterministic. I don't like the idea of just kind of saying, oh, well, hang on a minute, you're a bit low in that, so you're never going to be successful. I think that's a bit rubbish. So I guess it's nice to come back to it, really.
Well, we've spoken quite a bit about personality science on the Sports Psych Show. Maybe that's my bias, because I'm fascinated, and I love the fact, Joseph, you've alluded to the notion that actually personality science has some quite strong evidence underpinning it. We've spoken to one of the world's foremost personality scientists, and that's Professor Dan McAdams, based in Chicago, and Dr. Christian Jarrett, who's written a compelling book, Demystifying Personality Science. We've spoken to a couple of important researchers in the world of sport who actually get a mention in your research here, and that's Sergio Lara Bercial and Dr. Gillian Cook as well. I'm sure we'll unpack some of their work with relation to your piece here. But you've both mentioned this term Big Five. Joseph, do you want to briefly, just for the audience, tell us a little bit about the Big Five? What do you mean by Big Five? What are they?
Well, personality research, like we've already kind of touched on, is not a new idea. It started back in 370 BC with Hippocrates, where he thought that the amount of bile that someone produced was linked to, in their liver, was linked to how impulsive they were.
I think he's onto something there, mate.
Maybe, yeah. We've kind of come a long way since then, through the psychoanalytic approach with Jung and Freud's archetypes, and we've kind of landed on this interactional approach. And what that is that you are your traits, and your traits exist within you, and that is kind of the Big Five. I know it's been covered a lot on your show previously, Dan, so I'll go through them quite quickly. But the idea is a broad personality spectrum, and it consists of 5 traits. One is conscientiousness, agreeable, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. And like Laura kind of alluded to, these traits are not good or bad, it's context specific. But if I kind of give you the range, you'll kind of understand how we kind of categorize these people. So conscientious people, impulsive in its lowest form, but they're also in its highest form, disciplined and careful. Agreeable people, in its lowest form, they are very disagreeable and uncooperative. And then when it's expressed in its highest form, they're trusting and helpful. Extroversion, when it's low or reserved and thoughtful, and in its high, when it's expressed in the high, they're sociable and fun-loving. Neurotic individuals in its lowest form are calm and confident, and in its highest form are anxious and worrisome. Openness to experience, the final one, in its lowest form, preferring routines, and when it's in its highest form, they're imaginative and spontaneous. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the 5 traits.
And coming back to you here, Laura, I mean, I hear what Joseph is saying there with regard from a personality trait perspective, that there's no personality trait in anybody that's right or wrong, essentially. But I'm assuming that when we think about high performance sport, we probably want athletes who are going to be higher in conscientiousness, perhaps higher in openness, probably lower in neuroticism, maybe slightly higher in agreeableness, and so on and so forth. Would that be fair to say, Laura?
Yeah, I guess it's, as you were talking there, I was thinking, is it that we would want them, or that they're the people who sort of naturally float to the top in terms of they wouldn't actually be in those positions if they weren't conscientious? Because in every sport there has to be an element of hard work to dedicate yourself to training and competition. So I imagine it's a little bit difficult to say whether we really want those traits in elite athletes. Probably yes. Or whether actually elite athletes have these traits because that's what's required broadly, within a spectrum to get to those positions. And it's probably a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, really. So yeah, I guess those would be my thoughts on it.
Well, and to speak to that, as you write in the introduction to your research here, you actually quote Tim Rees's, Lou Hardy's Great British Medalist research, and they talk about conscientiousness in its extreme with super elite athletes. They can be quite obsessive and perfectionist. So as you're saying there, Laura, it's not necessarily that we're searching for that. It's just that those are the athletes who tend to rise to the top.
And they are outliers, and I think that, elite athletes are outliers, and I think that's possibly slightly off topic. That's one of the challenges of sports psychology research, is that often we're trying to apply stuff done within the sort of the under the bell curve, essentially under the normal distribution curve, to the people who are at the very end of it. And I guess also the traits that we might see. So if you think about Tim and Lou's work in terms of the Great British Medalists, some of those traits would be highly undesirable in outside of elite sport, but in elite sport they're highly desired because of their because it enables athletes to focus at such a high level to perform. And so I think perhaps that's a bit off topic and probably a discussion for another day, but I think it's about understanding that actually these traits are probably unique in this population because this population is highly unique.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, because today is about the relationship between coach and athletes, and considering personality traits and the interaction there between coach and athlete. That's today's topic. But I had a nuanced and I suppose somewhat complex conversation with Tim about this, speaking to this in terms of, as sports psychologists, we're trying to contribute to the field here in terms of how do we accommodate what we understand about elite athletes, that they might be a little bit overly obsessive and have these perfectionist tendencies. Where do we go with this? How do we accommodate this? But that was a great conversation with Tim, and I do want to talk about the relationship here, because Joseph, this was the interest for you. I mean, as a swimming coach, you as a coach want to know how you can take advantage of personality science, don't you? You want to be able to accommodate somebody's your students, your athlete's personality. You want to consider your own personality. And this is really where this research topic came from, is understanding yourself, understanding the person in front of you, and understanding how you can accommodate each other. Am I getting that right? That's very much lies at the heart of what you were trying to investigate here.
Yes, absolutely, Dan. I think it's probably important to recognise, you kind of touched on it then, that the work by Sergio and Tim and Laura is absolutely necessary and needed. And we absolutely have got a clear picture on what elite coaches and athletes' personalities are. So serial winning coaches are coaches that won multiple medals at top Olympic and Commonwealth and World Championships. They're low in neuroticism, they're high in conscientiousness, and high in extroversion. So this means they're a clear optimist, direct individuals with a go-getting approach. We also know that Olympic swimming coaches that have won gold medals, opposed to those that have just put athletes on an Olympic Games team, are more agreeableness. Elite athletes show high levels of conscientiousness and agreeableness and lower levels of neuroticism to non-elite athletes. And that work's really important. And we need to know kind of the population that we're dealing with. But the interactional approach between the coach and the athlete is, well, what happens if I'm not that? Or even a step before that is, well, who am I? And who are the athletes in front of me? And how do I get the most out of them? And that's really where the paper kind of positions itself. We know these group of traits, but it's kind of a so what? So how do they interact together in order to be successful and produce fantastic results in often challenging and not very glamorous or exotic environments, you know?
So tell us about the research. What was the procedure? Who was involved? And then we can unpack some of the results, some of the findings.
Yes, I was really fortunate that British Swimming allowed me to, and the BACA, which is the British Coaches Union, Swimming Coaches Union, allowed me to conduct this research. So what we did was we got 4 elite coach-athlete dyads. So when I mean dyads, I mean a coach and an athlete in a relationship. And we got them to fill out the big 5 about themselves. We also, so the coach did that and the athlete did that. We also asked them to fill out that questionnaire again about what they thought the athlete was and what the athlete thought the coach was. We then mapped that data on a graph, and we took that data along to individual interviews with the coach and the athlete separately. And we ultimately said, what do you think about this? And they came up with the first idea was this idea of a collective personality. And what that means was that the coach and the athlete felt that the combination of their personalities allowed them to be successful. So they weren't really interested in how high they were or low. It was the fact that their personalities together allowed them to be successful. And they did that in a couple of ways. The first way, which was just what the coaches acknowledged, was the fact that they wanted to develop people's personality. We've kind of touched on that already. But they felt that better people equaled better relationships and better performances. And when I mean better people, it kind of alludes to this idea that they had that range within themselves. So when you were talking about kind of context specific, we know that agreeableness is really good for relationships. You're kind, you're caring, you're compassionate, you think about the other person often. The names within the title, it's agreeable. But in the context of sport, that's good to be towards your teammates and your athletes. But you want to be highly disagreeable in the heat of battle, right? You don't want that person coming past you. You don't want to let them win. You don't want to let that goal in. So they felt that developing areas of their athlete's personality was extremely important. The second one within this element of collective learning was this cooperative learning. And that was centered around trait openness. And you have to remember that trait openness people are unusual. They don't like routines. There's a lot of exploratory behavior. So coaches and athletes felt that this trait gave them the freedom to share ideas, to experiment with new ideas together. And it ultimately helped their relationship because it bottomed down in terms of what that individual needs. So what that coach needs to provide to the athlete, but also what the athlete needs to provide to the coach. And then the final one was this acknowledge of conscientiousness. So both members of the relationship recognized that they had a focus, a drive, and a hard work ethic towards each other, and that allowed them to be successful. So really, the first kind of overall message of this collective personality was that coaches and athletes can't do it on their own. They need to work hard for each other. They need to learn what are the positive and negative of each other's characteristics in order to help their relationship and performance. And then they also need to be creative. Coaches need to find out areas of development and develop that to understand kind of what works for that athlete. And it really kind of strikes the chord. There's a big shift at the moment in terms of from coach-athlete relationship. Research 30 years ago was extremely coach-centered. It was focused around what the coach does. We kind of have moved towards an athlete-centered approach 15 years later, in terms of it's about what the athlete was about and what they need. And really, the most up-to-date thinking, and I have to credit Sophia Jowett with this, is the coach-athlete-centered approach. And it's the combination of both the coach and the athlete working together that forms coaching effectiveness and athlete performance and well-being. So that kind of theme really is summarized by that.
So let's just let me reflect back some of the things I heard you say there. So just actually going back to the way you conducted this piece of research, the athletes filled out a personality test, the Big Five. Coaches did as well, but also athletes filled out what that personality test with relation to what they thought the coach was from a personality perspective, and vice versa. Coaches filled it out for athletes as well. You took it to the coaches and the athletes and conducted a semi-structured interview, basically, in essence, saying, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about these findings? And from the data that you got from those interviews, you came out with some themes, and you've taken us through theme one brilliantly articulately there, Joseph. So that theme is a collective personality, collective learning, essentially. That it's absolutely, and I'm going to come to you, Laura, here in terms of your thoughts, because I'm guessing you weren't necessarily involved in the interview process, but you were looking at the data coming in and talking with Joseph, interpreting this as the data came in. What you learnt, Joseph, was that it's essentially important for coaches to develop the personality of the athlete in front of them, or look to be cooperative within that relationship, be open to learning from each other, and to exploit forms of conscientiousness, to work together to build focus, to build drive, and so on and so forth. I'm not too sure if I've neatly summed that up, but Laura, you were looking at this data, that collective personality, the interaction between the personalities of coach and athlete are important. What were your thoughts when this sort of theme emerged?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting, particularly because obviously we think of personality as the thing which makes us unique and makes us different, whereas actually in this context we're talking about it's how the thing which binds us together in the context of coach and athlete, and particularly I think again, historically we think of these things as being stable and not changing, whereas actually this research talks about how actually we are malleable to a certain extent, and actually we need to be adaptive in order to have these successful relationships in this context, and actually bring ourselves together in some ways, probably drawn on some things which we share, like Joe has talked about, in terms of openness, and that conscientiousness. So yeah, I think it's really interesting and just speaks, I think particularly, and Joe didn't really touch on this, what was really interesting was coaches and athletes were actually really good at identifying the traits in each other. They were really, they weren't ever very far away, were they, Joe, in terms of that aspect, which probably links to this theme around the idea of they have a really great understanding of who the other is, which allows them to then bring themselves together in this collective personality. And I think that in itself was really fascinating, about because I think we probably all think we have areas of our life which we kind of, not in a really deceptive way, but we shield. We perhaps don't necessarily feel that people would describe us in the way that we actually are. Whereas actually this research says that at this elite level, partners are really good at knowing who the other person is, and certainly successful partnerships, because they're the ones that we targeted in this research.
Any thoughts on that, Joe? Yeah,
no, I think it's probably important to kind of acknowledge that it's not just the coaches. So, and we'll come on to another theme that kind of links that a little bit, but like the athletes pick up on what the coaches do as well.
Yeah.
I feel like coaches are very good at observing, and they feel like they're watching, and that's part of their role. But this research kind of taps into the idea of the athletes do that as well, and coaches are performers in their own right. And that was really interesting to kind of remember. It's an important point.
And probably reflect upon, I think sometimes, because of the, sometimes ruthless nature of elite sport, we can sometimes feel that athletes are, the ones who to something are in charge, and that everything revolves around them. Whereas actually, some of this research suggests that actually it is important that they're aware of who their coaches are, because otherwise they're not going to be able to build this really strong relationship. And there's this element of, again, we didn't necessarily really touch on it, but it's like, I care about this person and I recognize who they are as an individual, and that's really important for our relationship.
There are 3 overarching themes. I believe we've spoken about one there. That's the theme of collective personality. And so, do you want to take us, Joe, through another theme?
Yeah, so the second one was this idea of perceived compatibility. And it's absolutely down to the what we just touched on in terms of the coaches and athletes' ability to understand what their coach's personality was, which it was a very small sample size, so we can't say statistically, but the raw data, they're pretty close, So what perceived compatibility means that both coaches and athletes felt that their personality and that of their athletes or coach enabled them to achieve their performance goal. And this was broken down in 2 ways. So it was personality similarity. So coaches felt that all athletes felt they were extremely similar to each other when they looked at the data. And from a relationship side of view, there's lots of benefits in having similar personalities. It means you can coordinate thoughts and feelings. It means you have an increased understanding of each other's interactions. And it means it's easier to predict your behavior of your partners. There's been work by Ben Jackson around this idea of similarities, in a particular area of interest of mine as I move forward, which shows that dissimilarity between coaches and athletes' extroversion and openness means that their relationship quality is reduced. The second element of it was personality complementarity, which meant that any differences in trait scores, both coaches and athlete felt that was a positive element of their relationship. And they use that, and the paper provides example in terms of kind of opposites attract. So if we had an athlete that was extremely laid back and a coach that was extremely bubbly, if there was an extroverted, if there was a situation where it warranted someone to speak up, that person within the relationship that was more extroverted filled that role for the dyad itself. And really, the overall message of this theme is it doesn't really matter, like we've already touched on, what personality you have. We're all different, and we should all glorify that. It's kind of what we do with that personality within our relationship in order to enhance exchange of knowledge or effectiveness within that dyad.
Is it that it doesn't matter, or is it that good coaches are able to adapt? I'm just wondering that in my mind. Sorry, Laura, I cut you off. You were going to come in there.
Yeah, I would probably challenge and say it's good athletes or effective athletes in their relationship can also adapt. I think it's a really interesting question in terms of whether it does matter or not. I think what this research shows is that actually these, and I guess it's important to stress, these were successful dyads. These were people who felt that they had a good relationship, because I think it would have been really tricky to try and do this research when people who perhaps didn't have a strong relationship. But I think what it suggests is that actually they could make it work regardless of how similar or not they were, and that they perceived there were strengths in both. So they perceived that there were strengths when we were really, really similar to each other, because it meant that we both reacted in the same way to a particular scenario. We both understood how the person was feeling, but also they could use it to their advantage when they were different, as Joe alluded to. So actually, I know that my coach is not going to be comfortable in this scenario, whereas this is my bread and butter. So I'm going to kind of take charge here, and vice versa. And so I think it's about the adaptability and willingness to flex a little bit, and also play to the strengths of the unit. And I think like lots of dyadic research, actually it's really important to think about this as a unit rather than necessarily think about it separately as coach and athlete, because some of the findings really suggest that actually it's their collective responses and collective perceptions which are actually important.
Similarities and differences in personality in that dyadic relationship. So, Joe, I mean, drawing from your experiences as a swimming coach, because I'm just thinking here, who's responsible? Because I know we're talking about an interactionist approach here, and one could argue that both are responsible. But I just wonder, as you know, in that sort of, whether you call it a power relationship or in that relationship with the coach and the athlete, surely, I'm making a comment here, it's not going to be a question coming to you, Joe, because you're coaching every single day. Surely for you as a coach, you're the person who's got to keenly identify what's happening in that relationship first and foremost, and maybe over time help the athlete be able to flex towards you, possibly. And I'm thinking, I suppose there is a question here for you, Joe, in terms of, well, surely in your relationships, there must be times when you think, wow, my personality here this athlete isn't getting me. I have to shift here. I have to flex. So I'm not sure if there's a question there or not, mate, but there's just a bunch of thoughts. I think it's quite complex, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think to initially start with, I think working with coaches is a good place to start with this line of research, because you're absolutely right. Their job, you could argue one of their main job or their fundamental jobs, is to build relationships with athletes and understand how they work. And you are right, that's an interactional approach, and the athlete's the same as well. That's why I'm a big believer in you have to spend a period of time with your coach and your athlete together to understand each other. There has to be that level of space and figuring each other out, right? What works, what doesn't. So I think that's absolutely, yes, necessary. And that's what drew me kind of to that work. But you're right, it is an interactional approach. And I think you can work within a range, and that's important to work within a range. But also at times it may be too far outside of your range, and you kind of need to acknowledge that if you are the athlete or the coach. I agree. There's no evidence to support that, by the way. That's just kind of what I think.
Any thoughts from yourself there, Laura?
Yeah, I think it's I think it is about the coach probably taking the lead in sort of being adaptable. But I do think that actually if an athlete isn't willing, I guess in inverted commas, because some of these things would be probably conscious and some of them would be sort of less conscious, I think.
Yeah.
But I think if they're not willing to also flex and sort of adapt to the needs of their coach in some ways, then their relationship is probably not going to go very far, because I think there has to be that partnership in some respects, and actually it does have to be both parties willing to be a bit flexible in order to meet the needs of the other.
And I think actually the final theme kind of touches on that really well, in terms of this is what coaches and athletes are doing. So the final theme is this idea of personality persona. It means that both coaches and athletes displayed a particular set of behaviours and personality traits that they themselves recognised weren't them, but they did it for the sake of their partner. So the first one is this idea of extroverted performance. So it was centered around when the coaches and athletes reviewed their trait scores or perceived trait scores of extroversion. And what that meant was that coaches and athletes increased their level of extroversion above what they self-reported. They were open and honest and said, this is what we do, because they felt that that was their role and that's what was needed. So the coaches always had to be high energy and positive and maintain good communication with the athletes. And the athletes said that they didn't want to show the coach that they were tired. So they kind of faked it a little bit in order to do that. So that's kind of an example of working within that range. And then the second one was personality modification. So they both adopted behaviours that met their partner's needs. So an example in the paper is the athletes were away at a major competition and they knew that their coach was extremely introverted. So they started to copy that. And also coaches knew that his extroversion used to annoy the athlete. He was too overbearing with them. So he tried to be more balanced around that. And the real kind of takeaway message from that is that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing that extroversion is popping up so much within elite coaches in environments, especially because of the fact that we know with extroversion, if you are an extroverted person, you'll go and seek out opportunities to be extroverted. You'll go and find environments to be like that. So really the kind of last theme is centered around if we're going to build successful coach-athlete relationships, we need to make sure that we're educating coaches and athletes that they understand themselves, and the big 5 traits is a good place to start. It's not the only place, but it's a good place to do it. They need to understand the situation that we're in, and then we can work in that space in order to use our response to that.
Laura, what's your learnings from this final theme, personality persona?
Well, I think I'm not supposed to have favourites, but I think this is the one which intrigues me the most. Okay. Probably for when I think about some of the questions that it raises within me, because I could, I've done quite a lot of coaching, and I can certainly see this idea that actually sometimes we have to, be a performer ourselves, and both performer in terms of a sporting performance, but also an acting performance. But what I'm really interested in is what are the long-term implications of coaches constantly feeling like they have to behave in a way which doesn't actually mirror the way they perceive themselves? I think that's really interesting as a future question. I think that has potentially some quite interesting implications for things like coach burnout, because I think if we're constantly feeling like we're having to be someone else, that's really exhausting. It has a potential to be really exhausting, and that may be moderated by like lots of contextual things. So again, if I'm in a successful relationship, both successful in terms of it's largely meeting my relational needs, but also successful in terms of the performer is performing successfully, then maybe it's okay that I'm having to be this different person. but actually perhaps if the relationship is less successful, then that becomes more tiring and more wearisome. So I think this is really interesting from a coach health perspective. And I think that's sort of, we haven't gone down that avenue with Joe's research. We've taken a different approach, which is fine. But I think this is an area which could really be interesting to tap in the future around how just what the implications are for people constantly having to be someone they're not really.
Laura, you mentioned doing plenty of coaching, and we'll come to you in a second, Joe, as well. Actually, and so, how much do you recognise this theme in yourself? You know, do you find, or have you found yourself to be having to be performative in certain situations in accordance to the athlete or athletes in front of you?
Yes and no in different scenarios. So almost all of my coaching, I have coached adults, but almost all of my coaching has been within youth sport by choice. Actually, I actually much prefer it. And so I think that actually, I would probably say there's been a transition in that when I was a less experienced coach and also less experienced in sports psychology, because that does really inform my coaching, I probably felt these pressures more in order to be this performer and to sort of, there was a really good analogy from one of the coaches, Joe, about how they felt like they were walking through, was it an airport scanner or something like that, where once they went through that, then actually it was like, ta-da! And so I definitely can resonate with that of walking onto a hockey pitch and feeling like, okay, right now it's I've got to be in a different space. But I also think as I've gotten further on in my coaching experience, I'm probably better equipped and more able to be open and honest with performers when I'm not feeling like that, because actually I think that that's really important for relationships, and even with young people. I think it's really important to, I guess, a lot of my work is interested in mental health and well-being, and I think it's really important that actually we don't try and gloss over when we're not feeling it, because actually if we're more open and honest about some of those things, then I think that's really useful in building trust. And so I think, again, if we looked at some of these things longitudinally, it'd be really interesting to understand how do we get the balance right in between showing enough of ourselves so that these individuals, the individuals we coach, are able to recognize who we really are. And clearly that was the case in these coaches and athletes, because as we said, their scores, their reflections of each other were pretty close. So how do we show enough so that people know who we are, while also meeting those sort of performance demands of being the person they need us to be in certain scenarios? And I think that's quite an interesting question in itself.
And so, coming to you, Joe, I mean, before I clicked record and we came on air, you were talking to me about the next, whether it's next month or couple of months, you're on the road a lot. You're coaching elite swimmers globally. So over the next month or two, are you gearing yourself up to being quite performative at certain times? Have you got to be a great actor at certain times? That's my first question to you. And as an addendum to that, do you think that at times you might have to have conversations with your athletes, with your swimmers, to help them understand what you're experiencing and perhaps help them understand your personality in order to get the most out of your relationship in the next couple of months, and maybe help them understand that at times you're not going to be able to act or be performative, and you've got to be yourself, and yourself is actually a different mold or a different version of you. So multiple questions there, mate. So fire away.
Yeah, I think kind of the first thing is, I was really happy that this came kind of out of the data, because I think everyone in all walks of life do this in some sort of capacity or not.
Yes.
It's not a new idea. And yes, I absolutely, on a Saturday morning when it's winter and the snow's coming down and the rain's coming down and everyone's tired, coaches, athletes, parents, sometimes you do have to bring the show, let's say. That's coaches and athletes, we all do that. I think what was kind of quite freeing for myself when I found this out is kind of back to the idea of we're all individuals, and kind of we don't need 20 Joe Stanford personalities in coaching. We need everyone to be themselves and to bring what they are. What I have noticed is with coaches and athletes, potentially when we are away with governing bodies or on talent ID programs, you kind of see coaches maybe behave extra than they normally would because of that environment. So for me, it's really helped my coaching practice in terms of just be you. And that's dead easy, right? Because if you don't know how to be you, no one else does. So from that perspective, it's kind of quite freeing. And what I can bring to a poolside will be different to what you could bring, Dan, would be different to what Laura could be bringing. And the benefits to athletes for everyone being themselves. So I think that's really good. The second thing is kind of that honesty element. Whilst there still is an element of performance, we really struck a chord with the athletes when the athletes said, I kind of exaggerate because I don't want my coach to know I'm tired. Well, if you're trying to coach someone effectively, it's probably a good thing that they tell you, right? We don't want to hide, everything to that. We want it. And if we're going to be successful in terms of coaching athletes, we've got to know each other well enough to know when we're being ourselves or we're not, So really, it was kind of, I hope that theme hits on that like freeing element for coaches in terms of you haven't got to act, you're not going to be a textbook coach or what other people think of you. You've got to be you.
And I think, sorry, if I can just come in there, I think again within the context of swimming, even the elite athletes that Joe coaches are young because that's swimming. People don't have generally long careers into their late 20s and 30s because of the nature of the sport. And so actually a message that it's okay to be you is probably even more important in those environments. And okay, again, that's sort of slightly out of the scope of what we looked at, but the research does suggest that being you with some flexibility to be adaptable is actually really important. And I think that is a really good message, because what we want is young people to accept that, I'm good enough in all of these contexts by just being me. And I think that's really important, really.
I'd like to conclude things by asking you both, as researchers, as coaches, what the main things you've got from this research project. But I'd like to have the opportunity to sort of give you my feedback here, and maybe get your reflection on this. I mean, I am a fan of personality science. I understand that people are reticent around it because personality is complex. And it's important to say that when we talk about the big five, we're talking about typical responses here, and that personality absolutely is complex and changes according to environment and situation. So it measures typical responses. But what was really noticeable in the results section, as you unpack the themes, was that in the small snippets of feedback from athlete and coaches from the interview, is that they were speaking in a sophisticated way around their personality and their perceived personality of their coach, because they were engaged in this research project, because they had done a big five, because they had a common language, a shared language around ocean, the big five: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism. They had some upskilling essentially here to understand the structure of personality. So it lends towards me kind of going, why wouldn't every dyad, or why wouldn't even every small team and larger team engage in maybe doing a big five, filling out the big five together, maybe understanding more around these 5 traits. I just want, and I know people get scared of doing that because they come back to, well, it's complex and everybody's different and everyone's different in different situations, but we do have typical responses. That's what we know. That's where the data is very robust, right, Joseph? So what it really, there's lots of things that in your research project got me thinking, but it does make me think, why wouldn't more coach athletes fill out these questionnaires and have better, more sophisticated conversations around each other's personality? That's what's got me thinking there. So that's lots of takeaways, but that's an overarching takeaway for me. Up to you, Laura, you want to go first? Joseph, you want to go first? What's your takeaways here?
Joe, do you want to go?
Yeah, so obviously I'm extremely biased towards this topic area.
Me too.
What I would say is lots of coaches have already done this in some sort of capacity.
Yes.
The problem that I see what's happened is they filled out some sort of personality, to a better or worse scientific degree. They've been told what their traits are, and then they've gone in a drawer and they've never been spoken of again.
Yeah.
What I feel what needs to happen is, and I fundamentally agree that, look, if you want to be a successful coach, you've got to know the nuts and bolts of it first off. Technical elements, tactical elements, whatever. The second layer is getting people to do that. But there needs to be a level of understanding in terms of what are your traits? So what does that mean to the situation that you are bringing? What are the traits that the athletes have? And what are they bringing to the situation? And then how do those two traits interact in order to form a positive or negative relationship? So there's really kind of identifying people's traits is step one. The next step is to understand how those interact. And look, for coaches, especially swimming coaches, this is not a new idea, right? We're quite happy to categorize aerobic training, anaerobic training, power training, speed development training. We're quite comfortable with this. But for whatever reason, because this is more of a psychology, biological elements, it's sort of complicated. Well, same with physiology, right? You don't know that aerobic, you can't guarantee 100% that swimmer is doing that. You can infer that, but you can't 100%. It's complicated, right? And this stuff's complicated. However, bringing in some of the language of the big 5 and other personality traits to start with is a good place to start. If nothing else, it's going to speed up your understanding of that person and then of you. And that can only be a positive thing.
Fantastic. Laura.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about what my reflections are. I think I've probably got some reflections from the applied context of I think it would be really useful if dyads and coaches and teams did this, but we need to be quite cautious about the conversations they're then having as a result, because what you don't want is I think what those conversations would need to be is, having identified these traits, how do you think they help you perform? Yes. And making sure that it's looking at that in an adaptive sense, rather than trying to say, oh, well, you're not high enough on this, which I think is just where people like yourself, Dan, obviously can create a role for yourself, and people like Joe as well, working in wearing different hats as a coach and as a researcher with his understanding of these areas. So I think it's just making sure that we're not handing out these tools without some support of what questions we should draw from them. And I think that's probably important. From a research point of view, and it's probably really important to say here that I am a relatively new qualitative researcher. Probably 50% of my work now is qualitative, but I certainly still feel more comfortable with the spreadsheet. But I think methodologically, stuff like this is really powerful, because I wouldn't claim that this is mixed methods research, because we haven't necessarily done statistical analyses on the quantitative data, but being able to use some quantitative or even objective measures, so observations or performance data, as a cue and as a topic to then discuss qualitatively, I think is really rich and results in, I think these athletes and coaches still probably would have given us some really good insight, but the level of insight they could provide us because we were presenting them with this data that they had filled in about themselves and their partner, just really added to the strength. And so I think from a research and a methodological perspective, this is really useful, really, really valuable, just to provide that deeper data, deeper understanding of people's experiences.
I love both your feedback there, and what I was getting from you there at the end there, Laura, was twofold. That the interpretation of the data we get from any kind of psychometric testing, such as the Big Five, it's so important to consider the capacity to interpret in a responsible way, and coaches and athletes probably need a helping hand with that. I mean, I've interpreted Big Five, the gold standard, the McRae and Costa Big Five test. I think it's 144 questions, and it does require some training there. So I completely agree with you, and that's very well said. And also, maybe help me out here. Maybe I misheard, but I like what you said about almost combining the qualitative data with quantitative data here, in terms of we can learn about people's personality, but maybe what does that mean at the coalface? How is that? What relationships can we draw from personality and the relationship between personality and athletes and coaches, and then the data from the swimming pool maybe, and observation of behaviors in and around the swimming pool, if we're talking about swimming, or the pitch or the court or the course. Would I be hearing you correctly there? It's almost broadening the data set and having a more robust set of data that we can draw upon some relationships.
Yeah, but I think also and again, this is moving into sort of research philosophy, I guess, but not being scared to present that data to our interviewees in order to inform their responses. I think, as we move away from, not moving away, but, we have a tradition in sports science of lots of our work being sort of positivist or post-positivist. And actually now we're starting to recognize that subjectivity is okay. And so I think, it's okay to collect some data and present that to people. It's not leading their answers. It's not putting words in their mouths. It's just informing them in a different way to be able to get their understanding based on a more. And when you were searching for your word about how you would describe the coaches, the word which came to mind for me was enlightened. I think that's what it is. It's enlightening our participants to enable them to be able to provide more insight into their experiences. We're not asking them to respond in a certain way. We're just enlightening them to enable them to elucidate that in a deeper way.
So it's almost a call for phenomenological research papers rather than being obsessed by a positivist approach. It's understanding that almost a structural phenomenological perspective, the structural being the Big Five, but the phenomenological aspect being how we interpret the world through the prism of the Big Five. I don't know if I'm speaking over my head there, but
yeah, and I think also there's nothing wrong with positivist research if that's required for your research question, but equally there are other approaches which are better. And and just recognizing that bias is okay. Joe was inherently biased in doing these interviews because he is a member of the community, but actually he would never have got these interviews if he wasn't a member of the community. And as long as we're open and transparent about some of these things and using our processes like critical friends, and I think that was something which we use really well within our interpretation of, I'm not a swim coach, I'm not a swimmer. So actually by challenging those interpretations, that can help to minimize any very subjective bias, but also it's just recognizing that actually enlightening our participants and having enlightened researchers it's not always a bad thing if that's important for your research question.
Joe, a final question for you. Given that you're a biased researcher, what biases are you going to take into your coaching? Over the next couple of months, you're on the road, you're visiting various countries globally with your swimmers, competing at the highest level. If I was following you with a camera crew, observing you, watching you, listening to conversations, and maybe interviewing you about how you were going about things, what has this research informed your coach behaviors? What are you going to be mindful of in a nutshell?
I think fundamentally, people are great and people are exciting and people are fun and sport's fun. So just explore that. Be conscious of who you are, be conscious of what you're doing. But by forming great relationships, you form great times. And wherever you are, whatever level you coach at, I mean, I don't coach at the highest level, but it's got to be fun. You know, and fundamentally, that's what it's about. So that's what I'm going to try and keep doing.
Great stuff. Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. That was awesome, fascinating. It's got me really thinking. Let's start with you, Joe, first. How can people, are they able to access this paper? Maybe they've got to get in contact with you. Is that possible? How can people follow you? Are you on social media? Are you spreading your wisdom in any specific location?
So yes, I think the paper's free access now. So the paper's free access to anyone. You just have to go on the journal website. In terms of where you can contact me, normally via poolsides at some locations, a good place to get me.
You're talking about a proper pool, not chilled out on a pool, by a pool in Mallorca or something.
Yeah, probably not one of those. I don't get to very often. Emails normally a good one. My email is joseph.stanford@ntu.ac.uk. I'm also on Twitter, which is just at j_Stanford, STANFO, but the O is a 0 RD.
Awesome. And Laura?
Yeah, so just to reiterate, the paper is now fully open access on Psychology of Sport and Exercise. So hopefully that means it's readily available to everyone. Best ways to contact me would be via email. So laura.healy, HEALY, @ntu.ac.uk. And I'm also on Twitter at Laura Healy Bob. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
No, thank you, Dan. Thanks for the invite.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast and I'd be delighted to hear what you think about it. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.